I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. What's that all about? I'm Joseph. This is Input English. Let's explore a few things in this wonderful time between Christmas and New Year's. In the United States, this time between Christmas and New Year's means many different things to many different people. Kids are frequently off school. Sometimes people take family vacations in the winter and go to wonderful places. But some of us were basically waiting for the next year to start. And a lot of the normal activities have been curtailed because of the holiday season. And really, the next year is going to start after New Year's. I started with the expression waiting for the other shoe to drop. And that's a metaphor. It comes out of New York City, and it dates back to the early 20th century. Back in that era, there was a lot of new constructed high-rise housing, and a lot of the people living in New York City found themselves living in this high-rise environment. These buildings were built without a great deal of sound insulation, so one of the common experiences for people living in these apartment buildings is they could hear their neighbors. They could hear them talking, they could hear them doing various things, and they could hear footsteps on their ceiling, which corresponded to the floor of the apartment above. At the end of the day's activities, it was common for people to take their shoes off, because back in that era, more than today, it was typical that people would wear their shoes in the house all the time. But at the end of the day, it would be time to take the shoes off in order to prepare for bed. So people living in these apartment buildings would hear someone above take the shoe off, and they could tell it's happening because they would hear the shoe hit the floor. But of course, everyone knows that shoes come in pairs. And so when the first shoe hit the floor, they were waiting for the second shoe to drop. That experience in New York City in the early 20th century was common enough that it became part of the language. And if you tell anyone you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, you know that they are talking about anticipation. Something's going to happen, but when? It's anticipation. So I am in anticipation of the coming year. 2025 is nearly upon us, and what will it hold? We know some things. We know that we recently had a presidential election, so there will be a political change in Washington. How that will affect us, we will see. No one really knows. A lot of opinions are being expressed, but no one really knows. One of the things I have done recently is thought back about the past and just reflected on things that happened, things that unfolded, things that were planned, things that were not planned. And I came upon a story that I can share with you about things that evolved in a very organic way and were not planned. When I was about 8, my sister would have been about 6. We were living in a rental house, and this was selected by my parents because it was in close proximity to the house that they were building that year. They had a contractor, and they were constructing their dream home. They had pored over the plans for this home for several years. My dad built balsa wood models of the house so that he could visualize what it's going to be like. They were very detailed. My parents had bought a parcel of land, and it was basically wilderness. It was in a neighborhood with large lots, and some of the lots had not been cleared of brush and trees. To our knowledge, this piece of land had never had a dwelling upon it. There was a road in years past that cut across the property, but that road has long since been removed. When my parents got this land, you could not see from one end of the lot to the other because of the brush. So the two of them, and also with the help of some friends, cleared all the brush. They removed the weeds and scrub. They got rid of most everything except the trees they wanted to keep. They decided where the house should sit, and then they got a contractor involved. So when I was 8, that house was being finished. During the summer when I was 8, I was off from school and my sister was off from school. The two younger sisters were too young to be in school. They were very young. Looking back, I can safely say my parents were very preoccupied with the building of the house and the planning of the move, which was coming upon them quickly. Now I have to introduce two characters, two neighbor girls who lived 2 doors down. Their names were Wendy and Bobby. Wendy and Bobby were 2 little girls a little younger than me, probably about my sister's age. And they had something we didn't have. They had a bicycle. Now, the bicycle was not appropriate to their age and size by any means, but they had it nonetheless. It was a pretty big bicycle. The frame had a cutout typical of what was called a girl's bike back then, and that goes back to the early 20th century, perhaps 19th century, when bicycles for women were made to accommodate their skirts. Now the distinction is really not important, but these 2 girls, Wendy and Bobby, had a large girl's bike. It was in riding condition. It did not have training wheels. And the strange thing is they were learning how to ride it. Now they were not tall enough to sit on the seat and have their feet reach the pedals. So the only way they could ride it is standing on the pedals and pedaling and standing in front of the seat. Because they were small and the bike was big, there was plenty of room in front of the seat for them to stand on the pedals. But you can imagine how difficult that made it for them to learn how to ride that bicycle. They also didn't have any instruction from their parents. Their parents were not involved in their project. So these 2 little girls had this bicycle and they could manage it fairly well, and they were learning how to ride it. My sister and I became wrapped up in this project. We put our heads together, that is, we combined our thoughts on how to do this, and as little kids, 5, 6, 8 years old, we devised a method to help them learn how to ride that bicycle. We would hold the bicycle still while they climbed up onto the pedals, and then we would walk with them until they got going, and we would go faster and faster, and then at some point we would drop off and they would ride the bicycle until they fell over. Now, children in that age group are very close to the ground and very flexible, so absolutely no injuries occurred. Nobody got hurt. Lots of falls occurred. Gradually, they learned how to ride that bike. There were no training wheels. We were the training wheels. It was teamwork training wheels. It was even quicker to teach my sister and me how to ride this bike because we had been watching it during this whole training program that they had. Within a few short weeks in the late summer, all 4 kids could ride that bike. Now, it wasn't pretty because none of us could sit on the seat and have our feet reach down to the pedals. We were all riding the bicycle standing on those pedals. Very awkward. So why the long story? My parents were preoccupied with building this house, and they realized what we were doing. They didn't choose to interfere or get involved. They just let us continue learning how to ride that bike. but it gave them an idea that it was time to buy the two big kids, me and my sister, bicycles. And so Santa Claus was definitely going to bring bicycles that year because we now knew how to ride bicycles. I'm not certain at this point the most common way children learn how to ride bicycles in the United States. I do know that there are a lot of training wheels used, and at some point those training wheels tend to be removed. So I suspect that in a lot of cases, training wheels, that is stabilization wheels on the back of the bike, are a big part of the training program until the kid learns how to balance pretty well. When my kids were young and learning how to ride bicycles, they each learned to ride using training wheels, which were subsequently removed as they became more steady and confident on the bicycle. That was the summer that the four of us taught ourselves how to ride the bicycle. No school was involved. No parent was participating as an instructor, so the traditional methods of learning were not involved, that is, school and family. That summer, the four of us were in charge of our own education, learning to ride a bicycle. Back in that era, that was not terribly common. Usually we learned from parents, family members, and school. In the 21st century, learning tends to be by a third source. That is, we are much more in charge of our own learning. We have to take responsibility for our own learning. We gather the resources, and then we manage the learning process without input from our family or a school. There was a book perhaps 10 or 12 years ago called The Third Source that showcased the fact that people increasingly are in charge of their own education. Looking back at that summer, it was clear that we were in charge of our own learning. But the other thing I saw was teamwork. We cooperated. As I thought about that period, I drew parallels to what we are doing here on Input English. This is not a school. This is not your family teaching you something new. This is just you taking charge for your learning process and getting a little help from a friend, a little bit of teamwork, providing some resources, maybe a little steadiness. And this appears to be the way learning is going to be to a great extent in the future. We're going to decide what we want to learn. We're going to gather the resources. We're going to make the decisions, how much to study, how often to study, what material to study, and the traditional accountability to our parents or to a school system are absent. I think these are exciting times to learn new things, new skills, new knowledge. In a future video, I'm going to explore what might be the ideal way or the ideal approach to learning English or dramatically improving your English during the calendar year 2025. If you like videos like this, be sure to click on this one next. See you soon.